Thanks for tuning in again, or for the first time if you're just checking out my channel now. I wanted to go through just a quick sort of experiment to see a quick watercoloring session on something in my sketchbook. I drew this, I guess it's a bonsai tree with flowering roses a couple days ago, and I thought I would sort of show my technique on how I watercolor it. Just to go over for those who aren't already familiar with my work, I make my own sketchbooks. I use Fabriano Artistico 90 pound / 200 gram hot press 100% cotton archival paper. Generally it's Fabriano Artistico, sometimes it's Lana Aquarelle, and sometimes it is Arches, which is a stinky paper when it gets wet. So I try not to use it that often because it's gross. So yeah, this is just some doodle page that I had that I was gonna watercolor in. So the reason I'm using yellow on all this stuff is because a lot of this is going to be brown and pink, and I knew that ahead of time. Oh gosh, there we go. I knew that ahead of time, so I like to go over to get it the right tone and saturation. Excuse me. I like to go over it with a yellow behind it first, so that it pops off the page a little bit better. And sorry. I was doodling these like tree roots and sort of stream of conscious stuff. Generally, every night, I keep saying generally, I'm going to try not to say that so much anymore. Every night before I go to bed, I try to draw for an hour and a half or so, just listening to some music or a podcast or something like that. And so that's what I sort of filled this page up with. One reason I will be able to get back into the tree more, but I put a lot of yellow on the bonsai tree, and I need to let it dry a little bit before I go in any further. So I try to always have more than one little thing to watercolor at a time. I'll sometimes flip back and forth between different pages, and I'm not doing that here, but oh gosh, the camera seems to be focusing on my hand more than the paper. I'll have to figure out how to fix that later. But yeah, so these are all just sort of tree roots that I'm not going to finish these in this video, but I just wanted to get the base color down. Sometimes I don't know what I'm going to do, but if I just go ahead and make a move like put a base color down, then I'll be able to, in another watercolor session, figure out what I'll be doing later. So yeah, the brush I'm using is a Fabriano God, I'm so used to saying that, is a Winsor Newton Series 7 Kolinsky Sable brush. I don't know if this is true or this is just my paranoid delusions, but there have been serious sanctions with Russia, and the bristles for these Winsor Newton Series 7 brushes are Kolinsky Sable, and it's like Kolinsky Sable is it's like a what do they call it? Like a weasel type. Sable is a weasel type animal, I think. And the best, unfortunately, the very best brushes, in my opinion, come from the Kolinsky Sable, and the very best bristles on Kolinsky Sable are the very tips of the tails. It's a horrible thing. But there's nothing that compares to it. It doesn't snap. Nothing snaps back as well, and nothing holds water as well. So now that I have and so what I was saying was, I think that it's really hard to get these brushes when these sanctions are in place, and you look online and nobody has them, or those that do have them, the prices go up like dramatically. So I sometimes try to, when the prices aren't so high, I try to buy a bunch all at once, because like that brush that I'm using there is maybe $60, I think. And if you take care of them, they do last a while. They can last several years, but I'm sometimes a little bit lazy. I never wash them with soap and water, which I probably should, but everything I use is water soluble, so I don't know how necessary it is. I just rinse it out real good and make sure it dries. And when you dry the brush, make sure it dries with a point so that it holds its shape. If you let it dry and it's all frazzled out, it will probably never come back to a point again the way you want it to, or the way I want it to. So I'm just sort of selectively trying to figure out, the drawing was a little bit messy, so I wanted to I'm sort of figuring out as I go along where the roses are going to be and where the leaves are going to be. And there's going to be the same yellow base behind everything. So now that I'm putting the red part on, or it's going to be pinkish orangish red in the end, I'm going to skip over some and make those leaves, and paint some and make those the roses or the blooms or flowers. They aren't going to be one color. This is just, again, the base color. I use many, many layers in order to build oh wow, you can really get a good nice focus of my thumb, huh? Sorry about that. But yeah, so I'm going to go over with pinks and oranges and yellows in order to get sort of a more depth feel to it. And otherwise you just go over and with one color, with one tone, it's really boring. And yeah, I'm going to try not to talk when I don't have anything to say, so otherwise I think it's going to get really annoying for you. So I'm going to be quiet until I have something I want to say, starting now. I'm using the very, very tip of the brush. Even though it's a bigger brush, it's pretty versatile because it's called a round brush, and it comes to a nice sharp tip. And part of the reason I use these nice brushes are because they retain a really nice tip for a long time. I'm trying to, when I mix the colors a little bit, get them into the camera view, but I'm sort of learning this whole procedure here on how to film this stuff. I test the color sometimes on the side of the paper. Like, again, this is a sketchbook. This isn't a final thing. This is just sort of experimenting and learning as I go along. I don't know what I'm doing yet. So some of that red was dry, and I'm adding that was an alizarin crimson mix mostly over a cadmium yellow. This is a genuine rose. I'm gonna kind of try to make the flowers have a little more depth to them. And now that each piece I'm doing a very small amount of watercolor, I don't need to keep going to different parts of the page unless I have a very short attention span, so I sometimes will do it anyway. Something will catch my eye. I'm like, oh, that should be pink over there, and I'll just go do that. And since I happen to have the pink color right there and it's mixed, I'll just go ahead and, oh yeah, see, maybe I'll do it right now. Nope, I think I'm going to go for the tree trunk. Yeah. So I don't wash my palettes very often unless I need a super pure color, because browns and grays are kind of difficult to mix the way you want them. But if you already have the base brown and gray already pre-mixed, you just have to re-wet it, and it's kind of nice to not have to spend the time. Because I don't want to mix colors. I just want to use the colors. So I don't want to waste time doing that. I just want to paint. So this is a base brown. It's not going to be that particular color in the end. You notice how I start in one end. Each time I watercolor anything, especially if it's a large piece, I sit back and look at it and I strategize, how am I going to get a clean wash through this whole thing without one end of it drying and starting a line. It's got to dry in a very even fashion from one end to the other as you're adding more watercolor, because it goes pretty quick. Otherwise, you're going to end up with lines that sort of, just for me anyway, distract from what I'm trying to accomplish in the end. And so, here I'm adding different colors as I draw it down. So I'm starting light, and I'm adding darker brown so that it's kind of fade down to a brown, toward like a darker brown, from a lighter brown to darker brown. And I do that as it's wet on each side. And then if I go over that in another layer and do that again, it'll be even more pronounced and more emphasized. And here I am going off the page. I don't do that too often. I caught that one pretty early on. I don't know what I'm going to do with those branch things. They just seemed kind of fun and interesting. I love staring at the cemetery by my house has some really cool old knotty trees, and I love looking at the knots or branches that have been cut off and then sort of healed themselves and grown over, and they're such a weird anatomical, organic, strange, random but purposeful natural growth that I like to stare at those and draw those when I go hang out in the cemetery. I don't hang out there, but I do. I don't know if you're supposed to do this, but I do some. It's huge. It's Greenwood Cemetery. It's this famous old 19th century, I still use today though, cemetery in Brooklyn that it's like the Disneyland of cemeteries. There's like a mausoleum area, and there's all these crazy weird little, I guess there's smaller mausoleums and hills and trees, and you can get lost in there. And I sometimes will set up my little nerd drawing chair and under a big tree where no one can really see me, and I'll just sit and draw stuff. I don't know if they would mind really, but I don't want to get kicked out, so I kind of hide a little bit when I'm in there. And I love drawing the trees in there. So I don't know what I'm going to do with these later. I'm just playing around. I'll come back to these at another time. After this, I'm going to go straight back to and finish up the bonsai tree. Those ambulances, I don't know if you can hear them in the background, but they're not as many as there used to be. But in Brooklyn, there were oh yeah, I'm going to do this leaf. Tons and tons of ambulances during this yuck period of pandemic in New York. So I'm going to fade this leaf from yellow to light color. So I'm going to start with a darker yellow. I'm going to go yellow up to that little broken part. And then I'm going to get clear water while it's still wet on the end of that last end of the yellow wash. And then I'll join the clear water with that wet water, and it's going to make a perfect gradation. And you do that a couple of times and it becomes really pronounced, and it's pretty cool looking. So once that dries, you won't see any lines. So I just continually keep on reworking and going over. You got to be careful when you add layers, watercolor layers, because if you add the wrong colors or the paint's too thick, it's not watery enough, you get these it gets real muddy and overworked. And I actually I may have overworked this whole thing a little bit. In order to add depth in the end, I added some very lightly tinted darker washes toward the roses on the edges of the trees to make it look like they're receding in space a little bit, and I may have overdone it a little bit. That's like a better tone of pink. It was too pale before, so I thought it's a little nicer this way. You always have to know how much water is on your brush. If you add too much, it'll pool up and make marks. If you don't have enough, it'll dry too quickly and it'll make a mark. I only want the marks that I make to be generally, I said it again, intentional, not accidental. That's a whole nother way of painting is by chance, and I do that sometimes, but not today. Now I'll go opposite on this. I'll make brown and, I love brown and pink together. That's one reason I do donuts with pink frosting. I love that color combination. Let's see, where am I going? Okay, so I've got some darker red, alizarin crimson with some green mixed already on the palette, and I'm going to add a little cadmium red with a little cadmium yellow and make like sort of a terracotta color pot. I don't know if it's the color I wanted, but I don't know if it goes as well with the rest of the bonsai tree. But because these are thin layers, I still have time to fix it a little bit with other layers over it. It's hard to know sometimes exactly how dark to go. If you go too dark, it just makes yucky smeary and it doesn't look like watercolor. You could just use gouache or acrylic. What's the point of using watercolor? If you go too light, it takes 9 million layers to get it to where you want it. So it's sometimes hard to figure out exactly. I feel like I didn't get enough pigment in this first wash, although it's never a bad thing. It just takes a long time. So now I'm just going over where basically the green leaves are going to be. I do not like red and green together. It's too Christmassy. It's too jarring. To me, it's like cross-hatching when you're drawing in ink or you're drawing with lines and you cross-hatch perpendicular to one another, like straight 90-degree angles. It's so jarring. It's so unattractive to me. I really don't like that. I much prefer cross-hatching that are different angles, not just like other than 90 degrees, more subtle angles. It's a little bit more challenging to do, I guess, but it looks so much better. And it reminds me of certain color combinations that are just too jarring and harsh together. And this is one. I don't really like roses. The flowers, it's not attractive to me. It's too simple. I don't know. But I wanted to try it on a bonsai tree anyway. And the reason I'm making, I don't know why I made these red. I guess sometimes I don't know what I'm doing. I just do it. And that's one reason you work in your sketchbook. You figure stuff out. You don't have to think too much. You can think about it afterwards and figure out, do a post-mortem. Why do I like this? Why don't I like this? What did I try that I liked? And then I can use this on something else later. So now the yellow is pretty much all covered up, which is fine because there's no reason for there to be yellow here. And now I have to start pushing and pulling with space. Well, with watercolor, you can't really pull. You can't make something come forward in space as much as you can make something go backward in space. And the effect of that will make it come forward. And what I mean is different temperature and I was going to say exposure because I've been using so many computer programs for art stuff, but that's not the word. So if something's darker and cooler, it tends to recede in space. And if it's warmer and lighter, it tends to come forward. You can't really make stuff lighter if you're using watercolor unless you add like a white gouache to something, which I don't do. I don't have any gouache. I should probably get some and play around with it. I've been saying that for 15 years, but I never do it. So I'm adding, you can see the colors, they're getting a little more varied because it's just a little more interesting that way. I kind of contaminated the yellow there, which is okay, because I was kind of done with the background yellows. I didn't need it to be so clean and pure anymore. When you're starting like a new yellow or a new blue, I almost always, if I'm not feeling lazy, it's not worth being lazy. I have to remind myself of that all the time because I want to be. You've got to change the wash water like that you're dipping your brush in. Sometimes if I know I'm going to be switching back and forth between warm and cool colors, I will have two different brush wash stations or cups. So I'll wash the initial watercolor off before I start a new color in the first one, and then I'll rinse it off again in the clean one, and that makes it so that you don't have to keep changing your water because the clean one is pretty clean and the first one gets most of the stuff off, and then you can just dip it in the clean one if you want to switch to a brand new color. Again, I'm brushing down. They call it, I think they call it follow the bead, B-E-A-D. I think I've heard that in watercolor class. Someone who taught a watercolor class that I was a substitute for. I was a substitute once for someone's class who taught at, I don't remember if it was Parsons or SVA, and they had me come in and teach for a day, and they got annoyed with me because I didn't do the follow the bead. I like to just, I don't go straight one direction. I go one direction sort of, but I don't do lines across to make the bead come down real controlled, because I don't know, I just don't do that. And I guess the students were supposed to learn that, and I was kind of, I look all chaotic because I brush all over the place. And anyway, that was not an interesting story. Suffice it to say, I don't do much teaching. I love that pink so much. So here I'm just playing around with adding another layer of pink, sort of more saturated, to give the illusion of depth. And since that's curved in many ways, you can kind of imagine what a bit of the shadow or the light might be doing on it. So this becomes drawing with the brush. None of the lines were there. I'm just sort of making this up as I go along. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But again, that's what the sketchbook is for. I'm just playing around and seeing what happens. And what's cool about watercolor is you don't have time to think. You just do it. And if you go in thin layers of wash, you can sort of hide stuff and fix stuff later. But I like the pressure and of not being able to cover something up once it's there. So my attention was just sort of diverted. So I went to these little pieces on the side. I actually think maybe the roses were a little wet, so I wanted to wait to paint some more of the green leaves because I didn't want the wet green leaf paint to mix with the red pink rose paint. So now I can keep emphasizing some of the dark saturated color in the roses. So there's water in the little palette there, and then it's kind of crusted and dried on the side. If I just take the very tip of the brush and wet it and then rub the side where the crusted color is, it'll be a much more intense, obviously. Oh God, this focus on my hand is annoying, sorry. Won't let that happen next time. Going for the crusty stuff. So already it's starting to come. I think I should have left some roses alone and let them let them stay a little lighter with just like the yellowy orange, but I kind of took it too far in some of these. I guess it's time for green. So I'm sort of twirling it around because I don't want too much on the brush, and I want to make sure the brush is real sharp and pointed. So that's why I do that little twirly motion when I'm in the palette. Oh God. Sorry. At least I have my fingernails are cut. I don't have gross fingernails. That always grosses me out when you see someone doing something and their fingernails are super long and dirty. Yuck. That's my humble brag for the day. I don't have long, dirty fingernails. There, you can kind of focus on that. They'll use a little bit how they're starting to, again, they're not just one green. I want to add some yellow and some different greens to it, and so that it's not so boring. It's something a little more to look at. Your eye doesn't just rest on it and look away. Like there's more to see to it than if it was just green and red. I suppose I really could and should paint with more intense washes. I've seen people do that recently on Instagram, and it's so much more satisfying than going with so many layers. You get a different effect, but it's like a nicer, looser look to it. I think it's harder to do that with, I use dry pigments and re-wet them. If you get them straight out of the tube, it's a lot easier to get those intense washes. I'm too cheap and lazy to do that because it's more expensive to use that much paint that often. I mean, it's really not that expensive, but I think it comes more out of laziness. It's also, I don't have, most of my paint is in my studio, and my studio is in Times Square, well, just off of Times Square on 39th Street and 8th Avenue, and I can't get into the building. It's shut down because of the pandemic. So I'm using what I can here. When I paint really huge watercolors, like 6-7 feet tall on the wall, I have to use, it would take forever to mix a color with dry pigment, so I use tubes. I use tubes for those. Oh, here comes another palette. This is the red one. I'm going to darken that red. So now what I'm trying to do is get little tiny parts that are darker so that it looks like there's more depth to these things, to the flowers. You don't want to get too much of this, but just enough to make it look like they recede in space so it doesn't look so flat. It's kind of more interesting to look at. I have a Twitter account. Like, one of my hobbies is taking pictures of old handmade signs on stores that are I call it good bad drawings, that are kind of not good, not professionally made, but they're done with heart and with intent, and as a result they're just gorgeous, and they're all completely disappearing. There's some left in New York and some other areas, but they're all being crapped out by computers and crappy people who have no sense of design or whatever. And so I try to document them, and when I take pictures of the signs for the Twitter account, I always try to take, you can add more than one photo per tweet. So I try to take one of the sign and the picture, and then one, so that you have a lot of depth and you have a sense of where this sign is, and you can see way down the street and in the background. It's so much more satisfying to be able to see photos with a lot of depth in them, where your eye can kind of, I think it helps to place the image in space, give it some context. So that's kind of the idea here too, is to place these roses in space a little bit better so that your eye is sort of tricked into thinking this is more, there's volume to this. It's not just a flat piece of paper, and it's sort of more satisfying that way. And if I were doing this more seriously, I would take more time and sort of calculate it and figure it out a little bit better, but I'm just kind of flying by the seat of my pants here. So now it's funny because a lot of these, I should have done the darker ones on the edges, not in the middle. And so it sort of defeats the purpose of adding depth, which is kind of stupid. It's hard to see that while you're doing it. It's much easier to look back in hindsight as I record this as I'm watching it. This is the first time I'm watching it. I just recorded it like an hour ago. But it's another thing that I learned just now. Focus on the hand. Again, apologies. Next video, I will not do that. But you can see how now that there's a little bit of darkness in the leaves, it's not just all one tone. It will hopefully add some more volume to the whole thing and make it look a little more rounded. I think I'll probably go back in on this a little more later just to make the edges a little darker so that it looks more like not spherical, but the edges go back in space. This is a little bit of a departure for me because it's not super clean and within the lines. This is like a little looser, and it's a good exercise for me to do because I tend to get too tight with my painting and sometimes my drawing, and it's good to get even though this doesn't seem that loose, it's good. For me it is. It's good to loosen up a little bit and not care quite so much about perfect clean washes. It's helpful. I actually did a little bit of warm-up watercolor before I started this. I almost always warm up if I'm doing watercolor on something in my sketchbook or something like that, just to get the juices flowing in my brain and get the palettes a little bit more wet so that they're accepting color a little bit easier. Ooh, I started with this. I'm like, ooh, that's not right. I don't want to do that. So I abandoned that pretty quickly just now. And I'm going to go, I guess, add some yellows or brown. I'm going to add, so there's a little bit of cleaner yellow on the edge there. Yeah, that's what this needed. A little bit of lighter yellow to push those, I just said you can't really pull very well in watercolor, but this will pull those a little bit forward in space. Warm them up a little bit. Each wash is pretty subtle. And I could take it a lot further. I could take really dark. I've gone so far as to take India ink, black India ink, into tiny little areas so that it really looks like there's dark shadows somewhere else. Here, I'm kind of playing with making it darker on the bottom for this first layer to make it look like sort of more real. Like again, I'm not duplicating. Well, I made this up, so I'm not making a photorealistic image here, but you do want to have some elements of verisimilitude to convince the viewer that what they're looking at is what they're seeing is what they think they're looking. Well, I don't know what I'm saying. You want to, you don't, it's not abstract, but it's not a photograph either. So That's why I'm adding some of the darkness on little tiny areas. I think I've said that same thing 900 million times in this video, so I'll stop with that. So now I'm adding a little darker red to it, so that just real subtle. So on the very edges, it's gonna recede in space. Right there, yeah. And I should have emphasized this a little bit more. This will help emphasize, meaning done several more layers of this at the end, because it will help a little bit. And I didn't do enough with the green too, unless I go back again a little bit. I think I do a little bit more. Yeah. And then I'm sort of noticing that dirt is a little too similar to the branch, so I'm going to kind of yellow and orange it up a little bit. But put different colors down and let them sort of make their own interesting little gradation, because nothing is one color all the way through. That could still use some work. The pot could use some work too. It's a little light. It's fun to imagine shadows on rounded things. I like that little pink weird branchy tube worm type thing above it, where that curve is. It's very satisfying to just make up strange shadows that might not exist at all, but your brain sort of registers it as convincing for some reason. Like here, I'm adding it to the top, and then it kind of curves down. Or no, I'm going to start the whole thing. I'll do that later. I'll show you in a minute. And be careful here because the dirt was still wet. I didn't want it to mix in there. I'm a risk taker. What can I tell you? I don't know what I'm doing with this dark green now. I suppose maybe more leaves. Yeah. Well, that's good. Needed it. I agree with myself with what I'm doing. There's some blue in that green, so it kind of automatically recedes in space a little bit because it's cooler, especially cooler than those warm roses. It's funny, when you start a painting, you start so light before it starts to get saturated and dark. You never imagine how long it's going to take or how much more you're going to need until you've gotten to that point. Or I never do. It's like I never remember, I don't know if it's like this, but I have the worst memory for weather. I can't remember, like every summer I'm like, I cannot believe it's this hot. It's just insanely hot. Has it ever been this hot before? And the next day it gets a little hotter, and that happens to me every single year with winter too, and coldness. Must be related to watercolor washes in my brain. It's funny how off balance the sort of the physics of this tree are, and I should have made the color more off balance to go with it. I'm just thinking about this now, but I didn't. Everything is really balanced here. I should have tilted the color in different ways on different ends of it, but oh well. A little yellow highlight there. I think if someone would have taken care of a bonsai tree this carefully, they wouldn't have let that little branch flop down on the bottom. Oh yeah, I'm gonna go with some dark reds here. What am I up to? A little dark red. That's alizarin crimson, and that was cadmium red. Even though it looks orange, it's called cadmium red. Oh, that's. I'm trying to pop out some of the edges of the flowers with bright saturated reds. It's funny. You're a different person. I'm a different person at different parts of the painting. I you're thinking in different modes. Like now I'm thinking bright highlights. Sometimes you're thinking. You can't imagine that you would be thinking this until it presents itself in the painting or the drawing. Like you can't plan for it. You go into highlight mode when it's time for highlights. Otherwise, I wouldn't have never been able to plan or see this ahead of time. Again, I will not. The focus will be better next time. Sorry about this. I don't know how. Maybe it's unwatchable. Probably. Maybe no one's even gotten this far, and I'm talking to myself. It's pretty far in. You must be pretty into watercolor if you're if you're watching it for this long. I don't think I would have. Yeah, so they're too similar to each other. So even the ones next to each other are too similar in color. So you want to add something to differentiate them. Add a little darkness to one, and the other one can pop forward a little bit. I don't even know. I've been staring at this for so long. I don't even know what this looks like anymore. I'm just looking at individual tiny pieces, and I can't imagine what other people see in this. It's hard. I have to step back for a day. I think I'm just about finished here. You have to be careful when you're pulling it off to the side to get some of the excess water off that isn't flick onto the painting. I've had that happen before. Sort of flicks the paint off the brush onto exactly where you don't want it to go. I don't usually put my palette on top of the book or the paper. I'm just doing that so that you can see a little bit of my mixing. There, differentiating the dirt a little bit from the tree, so it doesn't look like it's the same thing, came from the same place. Here's that nice little curve that kind of goes down there. It gives it a little bit of a illusion of curvy space. There. And I think maybe that's it.